In a world where many organisations want more collaborative cultures, agile structures, networks rather than hierarchies, and more trusting, honest relationships, what are the underlying conditions to really support long-lasting, meaningful change? How do we enable the quality of inner connection where these kinds of relationships can come about naturally? And how might organisations even harness all of this so that synergy becomes the way we do business? Well, very often, our attempt seems to be to work harder. We provide more knowledge, listening, communication skills, core competencies, and so on. But what if there was something more fundamental in our makeup as human beings that we're longing for? What if there was something else that to truly create change, we first need to tap into? In my work in leadership development through horses, often alongside my friend and highly regarded colleague Harriet Hamner, we design moments where both human and horse have the opportunity to establish something called limbic resonance. More than just the act of reading body language, this is a process where the systems of two mammals both attune and synchronize with each other's inner states. In the same way that in physics, a sympathetic vibration is created between two tuning forks at a distance, resonance is the experience of temporarily entering into the feeling, perceptual, thinking, relational world of another in which the other is experienced as one's own self. Now, probably everybody here at some point in their lives has had times where there appears to be a lack of sensitivity towards our inner emotional world and personal space. And it's in this gap or absence of the phenomena that we would typically notice, or I should say feel it, the most in everyday life. But if we are serious about wanting to get better at relationships, more attuned, harmonious communication, this could be a good place to start. And of course, it's not just us humans that have this capacity. Drawing on developments in neuroscience over the last 10, 20 years, we now know that animals such as primates and birds have the ability to relate vicariously to what another animal is experiencing as if it were their own experience through the mechanism of mirror neurons, each mind attuned to the other, each one part of a larger whole. Horses, in particular though, are masters at this process. With hearts 6 times the size of a human, almost 360 degrees of vision, horses have a remarkable ability at tuning in to our inner worlds, to what may be obscured or going on for us underneath the surface, and what we may be carrying for the systems within which we operate. Very often, this process of attunement will start to happen from a great distance, where the horse will start to clock us and be responding to us way before we've even entered the pen. A mechanism that has in part ensured the horse's survival over the last 60 million years. As sentient, co-regulating herd animals, a group of horses will often even constellate into a particular pattern that represents the dynamic that the client is bringing that day. So a group of line managers, for example, that are learning to step back from old micromanaging tendencies might arrive to find the dominant horse is nudging the other younger submissive horse forwards, a way of controlling their feet and showing who's in charge. Or the client who's preparing for a big promotion arrives to find one of the horses has broken out of its old restrictive grazing territory into a lusher, richer, more expansive area of grazing. Or the client who's desperate for a break arrives to find all the horses lying down in the morning sun, modelling for her what she's most longing for in herself. It's as if these creatures have an uncanny knack of sensing the emergent future before it's arrived. And so partly because of this capacity of the horse, this form of leadership development also works through the use of metaphor, where the horse and other aspects of the environment come to represent how we relate to our team, our boss, the tasks in front of us, the wider culture, but most importantly, aspects of ourselves. One standout experience of how even just a subtle shift in the quality of inner connection led to a fairly significant outer result was a few years ago with a client called James, who attended a 3-day training that my colleagues and I were running on personal impact and leadership. Sent by his organisation, one of the well-known players in the autos industry, James had recently been promoted to a senior level and was exploring how his leadership needed to evolve to serve him at this particular phase in his career, but also this particular phase in his life. He had been controlled by a strong achiever mindset, and so had been doing a lot of the delivering, driving, performing, and was really ready to look at how to balance all of that with self-care, how to become more relational. He knew that burnout was a risk for him, and so this is important enough to be taken seriously. He'd chosen a young female horse to work with and was experimenting with how to connect with her and what kind of leadership he needed to embody to meet the task of having her move over a small obstacle around a foot off the ground. For James, this obstacle represented the dilemma. And so because at this moment in time, the values of achieving versus self-care felt like they were in direct opposition with one another, this inner conflict was being mirrored externally through the behaviour of the horse. So initially, as he tried to engage, she stood there ignoring him. As he tried to engage again, she turned away. And then as he tried to engage for a third time, this time she walked away, so voting with her feet. It was not going well, and as a facilitator, I had to watch my own attachment to his end goal. 20 minutes later, we're still in stuck mode. It felt like we were running out of options. Until suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, this little horse, who had been in avoidance mode pretty much the whole session, quietly turned around to face them both, and then purposefully, yet calmly, beelined straight over towards them, and in that same relaxed fashion just hopped over the obstacle as if it were nothing. Shortly afterwards, she stopped to turn back as if to say, "You humans don't half make things complicated," because horses actually have a sense of humour too. Just notice the body language of the horse for a moment. The softness in the eyes, the relaxation in the ears, the absence of strain or tension through the body, and the sense of synchronicity between the two. And this is all without equipment. No ropes, no whips, nothing physical or behavioural to guide or influence the horse. In fact, nothing had actually changed in the environment at all. And so from the outside looking in, it looked like an act of free will. Can you imagine leading a whole team or an organisation like this? All parts of the system totally on purpose, where this type of synergistic relationship becomes the norm. So what actually had changed? Well, as an equine-guided leadership coach, a key part of my role is to be able to link whatever happens in the field back to everyday organisational life to make it useful and transferable. So part of this involves getting really interested in what these inner conditions are that make the external results possible. And so initially, when we begun that inquiry, at first, James didn't know, which is really normal, because most of the time, these little micro shifts are happening for us unconsciously. And so we take clients through a process where we slow it right down, we track the inner responses, and often, when we do that, it's our bodies that remember. And when James did that, he recalled that for a few moments, he experienced a temporary absence of the fear of appearing incompetent, big one for many of us. And this is at the same time with an absence of the crushing need to get it right. So one's a mental construction, the other's a feeling, but the two are inextricably linked. And when he did that, when he allowed for that, what do you think happened? So for the first time in the whole session, he actually becomes available. And for the horse, this is like a magnet. They want to be around that kind of presence. There's something inherently attractive about it for them. And so if we were to borrow from physics again, that same sympathetic vibration, if energetically entrained long enough, can synchronize and act in a sudden new harmony. This was the sudden new harmony. But not everybody has the benefit of standing in a field with a herd of horses sent by their organisation who's willing to pay for a leadership training with meticulous care and holding. So I'd like to offer a few simple tools that may yield more synergistic relationships in everyday life. Number 1, the power of pausing and stepping back to reflect on whether we're reacting or responding. By responding, I mean, are we genuinely able to choose our response to a given situation? Or are we feeling pulled in, compelled to react, to reenact some old familiar drama? Often an indicator that our reaction has very little to do with the here and now, and everything to do with something that we are carrying from old, from our history. Number 2, to name what is. This simple act will often have the effect of loosening the emotion's control over us. So a sense of anger, for example, or a sudden wave of nerves. And this is without going into a great big story about why we feel what we feel. But very often, the culture of the organisation will play a huge and yet invisible role in determining how free we feel within ourselves to do this. And so that's why we really need the executive function of the rational mind to support what is happening for us emotionally. An example of the rational and emotional minds working together synergistically. Number 3, reappraisal. A 2010 study by Mark Fenton O'Creevy across 4 major investment banks found that the higher performing, more successful traders not only were able to acknowledge and reflect on their emotional driven behaviour, but also able to actively self-regulate through the power of reappraisal. To consciously choose and evaluate how our minds are making meaning around a given situation can have a huge impact on the quality of our moment-to-moment experience and on our effective decision-making power, particularly when emotions are intensifying or feeling out of control. But note, none of these tools involve avoiding, suppressing, getting rid of, or on the flip side, inflating the importance of the role of emotion. Because synergy between people, teams, and organisations first happens when we align with and surrender to what is within ourselves. As the grandfather of humanistic psychology, Carl Rogers, states, the curious paradox is that when I truly accept myself as I am, then I can change. One of the gifts of horses is that they do not separate how they feel from how they act. It just is. And so here you can see horses doing synergy so beautifully. As the equine ethologist Lucy Rees points out, they're showing 3 principles. Cohesion, match each other's speed and direction, and do not collide. They're masters of network and all about cooperation and collaboration as their survival literally depends on it. As prey animals, having survived over 60 million years, if the horse is not in their body, in the present moment, they're much more likely to get caught and eaten by predators. Physiologically, unlike us, the horse lives within its design, moving through its environment in its 5 senses, emotionally attuned to other herd members, largely with a silent language of gestures. Whether in flight or in stillness, the horse's agenda is to join, and so they're natural teachers of symbiosis, synergy, and leadership. Continuously asking the question, moment to moment, who is leading now? Since we humans evolved following the arc of synergistic selection, our lives have been deeply interwoven with the horse. Our relationship with horses has revolutionized hunting, war, agriculture, mining, transportation, and the production of food. Fast forward now to the 21st century, and we're realizing that horses can help us to develop an experience, which is different to thinking about and discussing, helping us to develop and experience elusive qualities like presence, impact, and team cohesion. Evoking and mirroring and affirming the kind of connected inner and outer leadership that our world desperately needs more of. But we most often teach what we most need to learn in ourselves, right? And so I end with my own story of synergy in horses, this time with a friend's horse called Foxy. I was in my mid-20s working on the trading floor of one of the big investment banks, and I'd just started riding this young female horse in the evenings after work. Glossy brown coat with a black mane and tail, she stood at around 16 hands, which isn't shy a horse huge, but it's well out of the pony zone. She had a reputation for bolting and being a bit wild, to the point where no one else on the yard was really up for riding her. But I was ballsy, some would say stupid enough at that time in my life to give it a go, and so we begun. It was autumn, and that time of year when suddenly the darkness would creep up on you much sooner than expected. And so out of the blue, I found myself on a horse I hardly knew, in a forest I hardly knew, with no mobile phone, in the dark. Well, in the corporate world that I operated in that time, the dominant mindset was you must always have the answer, and you never don't know. And so as you can imagine, my neocortex was working pretty hard to try and solve the problem, which is chiming in very nicely with my fear of being stranded in the dark. But eventually, after about 45 minutes of trying many different routes, getting more and more lost, I started to feel a little desperate as I realised I'd reached the edge of my map of knowing. And so the only thing to do at that point was to drop the reins. But in that dropping, I was also dropping my need to fix, control, and solve. And I'll never forget what happened next. This little horse, who had this reputation for being a bit nuts, instantly dropped her head. She breathed out a huge sigh. She turned her nose to my left boot, gave it a lick and a nudge as if to say, "It's all right, I've got you." She then proceeded forwards at a jaunty, rhythmical walk with a long, outstretched neck, and at that point, my whole being completely knew that she was taking me home. As the saying goes, when the student's ready, the teacher appears. That autumn night, my teacher was most definitely a horse. Researchers say we have between 6,000 to 12,000 thoughts every day. We cannot possibly monitor every single one of these thoughts, but at crucial moments, if we are able to name the fear, the overdrive, the trying, the nerves, not in a victim, poor me kind of way, in fact, ideally without any mental narrative at all, but rather as if we were a guest house, welcoming in each new arrival as it is, in that naming something important gets a chance to transform. And if we surrender, extraordinary things can happen. Thank you.